This is John Drabinsky, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, doctoral students, and everyone in between, culture workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Theodore Foster III, who teaches in the Department of History, Geography, and Philosophy at University of Louisiana at Lafayette. His research works at the intersection of history and political memory, with special attention to how we remember and reactivate the civil rights movement and other Black freedom struggles. In this conversation, we discuss the place of historical work for political mobilization, the complexity of Blackness as an identity in the Black studies tradition, and the importance of creating spaces of Black memory and of Black study. Theodore, good afternoon. How are you doing?
Very good, John. Happy to be with you.
Well, welcome to the Black Studies Podcast. I'm really excited we found time today and to get your perspective on the podcast for a lot of reasons, and not the least of which, I mention this every time it's the case, it's just for both Ashley and myself really important to get as many people on the podcast who have their doctoral work in Black studies. I just think it's a really important perspective to have had that level of education in the field, and I think it offers really important perspectives, really important senses of what the field is and where it's going and all of that. So just wanted to underscore that, but as much as anything, welcome to the podcast. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you today.
Likewise, y'all have done a great job, and I look forward to the engagement.
Let me start, obviously we'll get to talk about the field of Black studies, how you think about it, how you think about your own research in relation to the field. But I wanted to start really with a more personal question, which is to ask you, what drew you to the study of Black life? And what drew you to Black studies? And always for me, what keeps you sustained? What keeps you connected to the field?
Yeah, that was a great question. And I was reflecting on it before hopping on yesterday. My formal engagement with Black studies began with a library book, bookmark with a Confederate flag on it. I grew up in the suburbs of Birmingham, a suburb called Vestavia Hills, and it's a white flight suburb, founded in 1950, school system 1970, and the other, context is a mother who, moved to Birmingham in 1979 as a member of the Socialist Workers' Party. She was a coal miner. My father's a coal miner. His father, my namesake, Theodore Roosevelt Foster, was a Black coal miner in 1906, Alabama. And so my mom had instilled upon me, and my father as well, a kind of recognition of the politics of the Confederate flag and the community that I was growing up in, which, chose this University of Mississippi mascot and name and iconography as a symbol of school spirit, which by the early 2000s had been removed from the official school seal. And I knew that because in middle school, my mom took me and our family to a school board meeting in which there was a debate over whether or not to remove the mascot. Right, and this is like 1998, 99. And I remember the motion being defeated, right? The name rebel and mascot remained. And the sons of Confederate veterans walked out singing Dixie, right? And so bearing witness to my mom's demand that we be there and, push back on this community-wide celebration of lost cause kind of mythology, brought me to being a sophomore and having the gall to take this bookmark with a Confederate flag to the school counselor. And she said, you know what? I think this summer program in Black Studies might be the best place for you. The bookmarks were removed from the library. We went to the assistant principal. That act was responded to in a way that I appreciate. But it's sort of a interesting or ironic development in that I applied to space that was transformative for me at age 15. A summer program called Telluride Association Sophomore Seminar that was held at Indiana University. It's a Monday through Friday, 9 to 12 seminar at the time, exclusively Black students from all over the country. I mean, Buffalo, New York, East Palo Alto, California, Dallas, Texas, New York, Brooklyn. We're all 16 of us living in a dorm, and the seminar was titled Constructing Race in Society and Law, taught by a sociologist, Dr. Dennis Rohn, and a Cherokee judge, Judge Steve Russell. And so for 6 weeks, for no credit in the summer, I'm getting a crash course in my first, critical engagement with race as a social construct, as a kind of like framing that was everything for me, returning to this racist suburb for my junior year, right? I was able to build community with like-minded students. I was able to found a high school club called Wise Club. Y is stereotyping everywhere. To alums of this summer program in Michigan and Buffalo also had Wise Clubs, and so it felt like there was a solidarity pre-social media with other Black students challenging, racist narratives in their schools. Mine being a bit more explicit with the Confederate flag, which just built a kind of confidence in the kind of student activism I engaged in high school, and sparked what Black studies could be, what university life could offer, and why it's important.
So there's something, I think about this a lot when I have this part of these conversations and hearing people talk about their paths into the field. So many of these stories have a moment that sound like a chapter motif in a memoir, and this idea that the Confederate flag, right, is banned from the iconography, but lives in between the pages of a book in the library. It's a kind of cruel poetry there. The intimacy of the book, the intimacy of the hate. Also in 2025, there's something really terrifying about this as a connection. But I'm curious how did you, that's an amazing, just by chance getting recommended to this program, which then ends up being so transformative. How did that experience follow you through college and obviously into graduate school, where you chose that as your doctoral field?
Yeah, I think it's important to note, right, Telluride Association was founded in the early 20th century by Lucius Nunn, who has a house at Cornell University. And so there's a prestigious junior program, rising junior, right, going into your senior year, called Telluride Association Summer Program. And that one is very competitive. I was able to get in only because I did the sophomore seminar, which in the imagination of the board of Telluride Association, which today has a endowment of $54 million, right? They have a ton of money to offer summer programs and housing throughout the year, and a kind of storied legacy. Michel Foucault, Paul Wolfowitz of the World Bank, Gayatri Spivak, all have spent time at the Telluride House at Cornell. It's a huge mansion that after doing the sophomore seminar in Indiana in Black Studies, I did the junior program, which was in the humanities writ large. This was a seminar titled Pleasure and Danger, Bodies in History, Philosophy, Science, and some other, traditional subject. We read Judith Butler. We read, History of Sexuality. We read Hartman, Scenes of Subjection. It was way over my head. I was not
high school.
In high school. And there were students. There were students in the seminar who actually were able to engage. I remember looking to my left and saying, "Look at this word, cacophony. What does that mean?" And he was like, "Oh, cacophony. Yes, it means X, Y, Z." Right. And so all of these students at Cornell, the junior program, not the sophomore seminar, went on to Harvard, Yale, Princeton. Right. They were on that conveyor belt. And what's interesting is that this sophomore seminar in Black Studies was imagined as a feeder, right? Because they wanted to diversify the junior program and eventually diversify the board. And so I eventually, sat on the board of Telluride for about 13 years and was able to really reorient this feeder kind of orientation to these summer programs, and this idea that these poor Black students need an all-Black sophomore experience in order to be prepared for the junior experience, the white experience, right? And so, this developed an ongoing engagement with Telluride, this educational nonprofit, but also exposed me to the possibilities of universities outside of Alabama, right? I spent a summer at Indiana University, a summer at Cornell, and then they have these college students who run the programs during the 6 weeks. And so I did that in 2007, 2008 as an undergrad at UAB, at Michigan and Indiana. And so I'm getting exposure to Black studies and adjacent, Black content studies, as Josh Myers would describe it, right, through this ongoing engagement with Telluride, which allowed me to then contrast what I was getting at UAB, which was a very tokenized, under-resourced program, not department, in Black studies, right? I came in freshman year knowing I wanted to do Black studies, which is very unusual in my experience. It's normally after someone takes a class that they realize, I don't want to be an engineer, I don't want to do a history major, let me get a Black studies degree, and maybe I'll do the pre-med kind of courses in order to still do med school. But I came in knowing I wanted to do Black studies, and excited that, UAB at the time in 2005 was the only bachelor's in African American studies and the first in the state of Alabama. And so I entered with a sense of perspective on what Black studies could be, and disappointment at what it was my freshman year. But I found, several Black scholars who poured so much into me that despite transferring or applying to transfer to Temple University, because I was told my freshman year that Temple had the first PhD in Black studies, and so that's where I got to go. I'll go to Philadelphia. It wouldn't have worked out. My parents didn't have the money, and Temple has a storied history, Lafayette, Sante, Nathaniel Norman, among many others. But I needed to be a quote-unquote big fish in a small pond. I found scholar and Dr. Delita Martin Agunshula, who got her PhD in Afro-Hispanic literature from Ohio State in the 1970s, and was a part of that kind of institutionalization of Black professoriate in the 1980s, in Alabama, at least, was my mentor, right? She had long been the director of foreign languages at UAB, and her scholarship was on Quince Duncan, a Afro-Costa Rican poet, and had become director after the founding director in 2000, Nee Coker, left after 4 years for Washington University, St. Louis, where there was better resources and support. And sort of left the program high and dry. And so Dr. Gunshula, having all this experience as administrator and legitimate background in, Black diaspora studies, she's also a Langston Hughes scholar, became director. She came to my Eagle Scout ceremony trying to recruit me and keep me in the program, right?
Oh, wow.
My sophomore year, I was presenting at the National Council of Black Studies because she got me and 3 other students together to put together an undergraduate student panel, got funding to go out to San Diego, State University, where I was able to engage with grad students in Black studies. Only one faculty member from Michigan State showed up to our panel, which was sort of devastating, right? Which happens. But he gave us serious attention and care. And I found that, throughout my UAB career, in these Black faculty, like Dr. Agunshula, who saw me through my 4 years there. My intro to Black Studies professor, Dr. Askari Hodari, was joint appointed in psychology and the program in African American Studies at UAB, which is really dual appointment, not joint appointed. Psychology was the anchor, and she never got tenure. White students in psychology claimed that she was racist. And she was unaware the powers that be at UAB that were pushing her out, and did not necessarily get the kind of background support from Dr. Gunshula and others that she might have. But she has her PhD from Howard, Dr. Hodari. She has 2 books, not in academia. One called The Black Book of Proverbs, which is so beautiful. It has a foreword by Desmond Tutu, and she has a book called The Black Book of Names, which, has an orientation to Black communities and Black knowledge production for liberation that I find really important and was really important for my undergraduate career. But it was also really devastating to, come back from Ecuador, where I spent a semester abroad junior year, and Dr. Hodari was gone. Wow. And there was no real discussion as to why she left or how she was put out. And so that left an important sour kind of taste in my mouth as it relates to tenure track positions or joint appointed positions, and the kind of tenuous patchwork that Dr. Gunshla had to affect as the administrator, where there really weren't faculty who could teach a curriculum that would seriously offer, I would say, a competent BA, much less a critical BA in African American studies, given higher education in Alabama. And I should also say one of the other scholars in undergrad that really was transformative was Dr. Horace Huntley, who was an Air Force vet going to undergrad in University of Minnesota in 1969 and was a part of the Black student movement there, right? And so he shares stories of trying to recruit James Turner, right, of Africana Studies at Cornell, who was a PhD student at sociology at Northwestern at the time, to come to Minnesota and be a part of that birth of Black studies there. Dr. Huntley and 2 other Black students took over administration building. As we know, the history of Black studies is really a part of. Minnesota tends to get left out of this discussion. Ohio State, Cornell, San Francisco State University. So many universities had these Black students, organizing for change, right? It was called the Moral Hall Takeover. And Huntley went on to get his PhD with David Montgomery at the University of Pittsburgh, and really sort of in the mold of labor historians, did work around Black labor in Birmingham, returned to Birmingham, and was a part of the founding of the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. And in particular, Dr. Huntley's role was the oral history project that recorded narratives of the foot soldiers of the civil rights movement in Birmingham and Black freedom movement in Birmingham, that today is a treasure trove of archive of people who are long gone at this point, right? The Birmingham Civil Rights Institute was founded in the early 90s, and he's doing these oral history collections then. Also never gets tenure at UAB. Right? Has to sue UAB in order to get a recompense, but had this funky kind of institutional arrangement between the history department and the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, right? That calls into question, how do we measure and or evaluate service, scholarship, and what accounts for tenure in Black studies, but also more generally for the Black scholar, right? Because he poured so much into the community of Birmingham that to me was obvious he deserved tenure. But for the history department, right, he did not get that monograph, right, that would meet the mark. Meanwhile, there are other professors who have 12 books who are just pumping them out, but he had this other dual kind of commitment. And so it was an honor that my first Black male professor was Dr. Huntley, and somebody who has a direct connection to the founding of Black studies, but always sort of had an outsider role in the program because he had a more militant orientation to what Black studies should be, and not one that was like Black studies in English, Black studies in sociology, right? He thought there should be a department that stood alone. Meanwhile, Black faculty in English who wrote the proposal for the Black Studies BA in 2000 disagreed with him. And so he was this insider-outsider in Birmingham that also just impressed upon me the work of Black Studies and the peril and or promise of the university, right?
That's an incredible education, not only in the history of the field, sort of content of the field, but the politics of scholarship, in which Black studies is so often ensnared, right? The politics being the sort of expectations and norms of monographs, and the model of the solo researcher versus another kind of engagement, another kind of relationship. I also want to say, just intra podcast, is a funny coincidence that a podcast that's going to come immediately before you is, you mentioned UAB and Temple, will be a UAB professor, Matthew Simmons, who got his PhD at Temple.
Wow.
So
Yeah.
this is funny, when you mentioned Temple and UAB. So, but it's, there's so much in what you said. So I'm really, and I'm always happy when people's names are mentioned. People who, fall on all kinds of parts of that story, right? Of injustice, of introducing you to a thing that obviously is something that's now oriented your at least professional life, and I assume more,
For sure.
as well as that tutelage in the history of the field and the kind of political and moral demands that it has. I really love that. Yeah, and in some ways, I think it transitions into this next question, which is about the field of Black studies. Given all of that, and then also your PhD in Black studies from Northwestern, I'm curious what portrait of Black studies you work with. If you could talk a little bit about that. And I think about it in relationship to the origins of the field, which you've already discussed a little bit, which is that tension at its founding. On the one hand, there was the demand for the study of the Black intellectual tradition, which didn't have a home in disciplines. Black studies was going to be that place, student demand, maybe some professors, but largely student demand. But also in the late 1960s and early 1970s, as a transformation of the Black liberation struggle, which really collapsed those distinctions between classrooms and communities, between study and activism, between ideas and radicalism. And that political prescriptive demand of Black studies has always had a kind of tension with that other intellectual pursuit of the Black intellectual tradition, whether it's expressive or historical, sociological, and so forth. And it's a tension. It can be productive, it can be complementary, but it's a tension, I think. And it stays with us today, I think, even more in 2025 as we start to think about what is the future of Black studies. So for me, it's, I always want to hear from people, what's their portrait of Black studies, but also maybe sort of massage the framing of that question with the origin story of the field itself.
No, great question. And I'll build on my trajectory because there's been some roadblocks and other experiences like adjuncting that I did after I got my master's from Ohio State. I went straight from the undergrad in 2009 to Ohio State and really didn't have, I knew I wanted to do a project in Afro-Latin America, right? When I was in undergrad, I did a semester abroad in Quito, Ecuador, and intentionally chose Quito because within kind of like popular understandings of Black diaspora, the Afro-Andes was, I know now looking back, a kind of exceptional outlier of like Blackness vis-a-vis the nation state, vis-a-vis Latin America. It's not Brazil, it's not Cuba, right? And one of my Telluride compatriots who I met in 2003 joined me for this service learning semester, spring 2008 in Quito. And we were both, differently positioned in Ecuador. Like, she is from Buffalo, New York, comes from a pretty elite background. Her aunt is Carla Holloway. Her grandparents were among the first, pediatric doctors in Buffalo, New York. They're all graduates of Talladega College, the oldest HBCU in Alabama, and are part of a kind of like, Great Migration, Black excellence kind of experience or narrative. But in Buffalo, New York, in an upper middle class home, never experienced anti-Black racism until she went to Ecuador. She is racialized, much darker skinned than me. I have a white parent. And so in Ecuador, I was a curiosity, but certainly not obviously Black. She couldn't get a taxi, policed at the university. When I was in third grade in Alabama, however, I was asked by a white student, why am I half white and half nigger, right? dealing with the Confederate flag as a symbol of antagonism in high school was something that was familiar to me, and having an activist, organizer-oriented mother gave me the kind of like spirit of resistance and activism that I think is in the kind of energy and history of Black studies. That certainly is a tension that it was, by the time I got to Ohio State, sort of institutionalized and uneven, right? Ohio State has a Department of African American and African Studies. That area studies inclusion is really ill-fitting to that department, and yet I was able to take classes with Kwaku Karang and Lupanga Mpandi around Southern Africa and Western African culture and society that for their diaspora track was important, even though there was nobody in the department at the time when I was doing my master's who did work in Afro-Latin America. So like at Ohio State, I wanted to continue this, question around race and Blackness in Latin America, and wrote a thesis on Benjamin Carrion, who was this public intellectual in Ecuador in the 1930s, who was building on Jose Vasconcelos's Raza Cosmica, which was like a 1930s text on really mestizaje, this idea of like racial mixture in Latin America not being pejorative as the Anglo-American U.S. giant would, write and or project, but actually a positive, right? But of course, Blackness still being at the bottom of that racialization. And so being at Ohio State was great because I got it was a 2-year terminal master's program. I was able to further my studies at a university that was better resourced, but that department at the time was just very uneven in terms of leadership, in terms of course offerings, in terms of my own training. And so a first-year assistant professor, Sheikh Thiem, who writes on, he's from Senegal and writes on negritude, philosophy, and Black studies, a brilliant scholar, was paired with me, and I was doing work in Spanish-speaking Latin America. And so he ended up being a co-chair with Teresa Delgadillo in comparative studies for my project. That I'm fortunate I was able to get a thesis out, but it was just really, like I said, uneven. Ohio State has a community extension center that was part of the compromise with the university in the east side of Columbus, which is the Black side of Columbus. And so most Black studies programs don't have a standalone building in a Black community born of that demand that the university transform and be more relevant to those communities. And so there's Wi-Fi, there's computers, there's classes offered. So that experience was enriching, both in terms of like what Black studies could be and what it might not actually serve. And so I returned to UAB or to Birmingham after being disillusioned with academia. Didn't apply to PhD programs after I graduated in 2011, and found great purpose being, as you mentioned at the beginning, like somebody trained with a master's in Black studies teaching at my alma mater, which led to me organizing with students to challenge the university to adequately invest in the program. Because I had, again, through Telluride, understood the tokenized, underfunded norm, which felt more like Blacks studying, right, than Black studies at UAB. Widely understood easy A classes, not at all intellectually engaging or critical. I mean, I had colleagues graduate from UAB in Black studies and assume Fanon was a white man, right? Because the level of engagement was so low. And so students, with my support and direction, organized a group called Ubuntu UAB, I Am Because We Are. And in 2013, during the 50th anniversary of 1963 in Birmingham, right, the Project C at the SCLC's, confrontation with Bull Connor, iconic, the fire hoses and dogs, kind of imagery, but also the bombing of the 63 Baptist Church that killed, right, Addie Mae Collins, Carol Robertson, Denise McNair, and Cynthia Wesley. Were being honored that year. And so we were able to use that memory of 63 to challenge the university. We read the entirety of a letter from a Birmingham City jail and a public protest. There were demand letters and really a challenge to UAB to be better. And in many ways that led to one, me being ostracized from UAB in the program, because once they realized this adjunct professor is supporting students organizing for change, I became kind of, the negative bad guy to the new regime of African American studies that came afterwards, right? And so to this day, the program is still a program. Matthew Simmons, grateful for his commitment to teach at UAB, but in a position that is non-tenure track, is 4-4, right? Which, as the perspective of a student, right, and as a student activist, these faculty are not in the best position to get their book done, to get their scholarship done. They're on trajectory to be overworked and burnt out. But also, they're applying every year to other jobs that are, more where there's more support, and I that's just such a disservice to those students. And yet, that compromise is what Black Studies looks like in Birmingham, which for me is like an impossibility. And so it was that activism that brought me to Northwestern. When I was an adjunct, they had a summit of PhD programs called A Beautiful Struggle, where I drove up to Chicago and was able to interact with who would be my first PhD advisor, because I was doing this Afro-Latin America kick, in Sherwin Bryant, who does excellent work in early modern Latin America, making the argument that, even though Ecuador and Colombia at the time didn't have a huge enslaved Black population juridically into the Spanish crown in terms of colonial power, Blackness was, key to exercising power, or racializing bodies, and stealing land, right? That summit of PhDs in 2012 is one of those kind of like crystallizing iconic moments. If you talk to Josh Myers, if you talk to Alex Wahalia, I think he mentioned on the podcast too, was like I would say probably the only actual gathering of, at the time, 14 PhD programs to really debate what we are doing as a doctorate kind of field, offering, Africana, African American and African diaspora studies at Indiana University, and African American studies at Northwestern. And so had I not gone there as an adjunct, had I not been organizing students, right, to challenge the university to be better, I know the faculty at Northwestern would not have been as keen to accepting me among the 99 students who applied to that program in 2013.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so Northwestern was a whole different beast of intellectual awakenings for me, right? The movement for Black Lives is really taking shape. 2012, 2013, 2014. Chicago was a hotbed of organizing historically, and certainly with the killing of Laquan McDonald and the rise of BYP 100, Black Youth Project 100, it was a rich space to be doing doctoral work in Black studies. And I had a choice, right? Do I continue with this work in Afro-Latin America, questions of diaspora and Black studies in Ecuador, or do I turn back home to area and subject I thought that everything had been written already? The civil rights movement, we know those stories. It's done. I took a memory studies class with Michelle Wright, and I took a diaspora theory and trope class with Dr. Wahalia, Alex Wahalia, and both of those blew up my narrow understanding of what I could contribute to, right, what is now my research and the book project, the politics of civil rights memory, right, that I experienced as an adjunct, this, misremembering through commemoration, this forgetting through the 50th anniversary of 63. And now there's the 60th anniversary that just took place, and it's taking place this year of, right, Bloody Sunday in Selma. These are contested sites that are ongoing sites of struggle that the PhD Northwestern opened that door for. And so I moved my project away from Ecuador and toward, the U.S. South, and thinking through this intersection of history, of memory, of Black politics. That really gets back to this question that I was wrestling with at UAB. Like, why? And people always assume this, right? Birmingham, right, it's like legacy in that 63 kind of frozen moment, must have a department of Black studies, must have a PhD in Black studies. But if you know anything about higher ed, if you know anything about the politics of Alabama, right, the state agency that approved the BA in African American Studies in 2000 had to use a language of Black studies as promoting integration in Alabama. Right. That was how the program was pitched. And that's how that was the compromise I waded through as an undergrad, that I only at Northwestern was able to fully see, right, with a lot of really good critical scholarship, right, this uneven relationship between this history of Black student activism and this fully incorporated field that, at least in Alabama and in many other places, does a disservice to kind of the origin story of Black studies, right?
Yeah. So let me follow up on that then. I mean, it's so interesting the way, the relationship between study, right, intellectual life and activist work. It was no simple equation in what you were saying. I think that's extremely interesting, and it's one of those ways that when I asked the question about the sort of tension at the founding of Black studies, when I say tension, one of the things I like about tension as a word is that it is about entanglement and pressures that create entirely new senses of what an intersection looks like. And I think you really articulated that well, that Black studies is committed to a certain kind of intersection of histories of political struggle, history of ideas, also the way studying ideas allows us to think about political struggle differently. And that was quite a moment to come to Northwestern too, I have to say. That's a really remarkable moment for all of you there. And that conference also came up in Tasha Levy's podcast. So it just comes up. It's interesting. I think it needs in some ways its own podcast. Maybe we'll have to have a topical podcast where you all talk about that moment. I really mean that. I think it was so interesting for the institution of the field of Black studies, and just hearing people talk about how important it was and that it hasn't been repeated is super interesting to me.
And it wasn't recorded, to the best of my knowledge, either, which is, unfortunate. But to your point, right, there are all these folks who I didn't know. I didn't know Josh Myers was there, but like Ernest Gibson, so many grad students at the time at UMass Amherst and other places who are now, tenured faculty. It would be beautiful to hear that kind of chorus of what it meant then and what it means now.
Stay tuned in your email. This is a great idea. I love this. So I'm interested in to pick up with this, your description of the content of your research and interests around your educational experience. And I'm interested in hearing you reflect a little bit on how your master's and PhD being in Black studies, and then your current work being in that field, you don't really have a moment where you have a passage through a discipline. And as I said at the very, very beginning, this is one of the things that Ashley and I find particularly important about the podcast, getting people who did PhDs in the field. Mm-hmm. But this is also a moment where I want to ask that question about how you think that complete and total grounding in the field of Black studies, rather than coming through a discipline or, transforming yourself as a disciplinary scholar in Black studies, how you think that pure immersion in the field has shaped the way you understand what scholarship means. But also for me, I want to also ask how it shapes how you conceive and execute a classroom.
Excellent question. Disciplinarity has been on my mind for a while, ever since Alex introduced us to Sylvia Winter's essay, Mistaking the Map for the Territory, right? Which, what is the territory of Blackness that the map, Black studies and or Black life, Black history, is in relation to. And so I always emphasize I'm a Black studies scholar who does history, not a historian who does Black history, Black content, right? Yeah. Which is, to say there's a particular orientation to the work that shows up in the classroom, shows up in my scholarship, shows up in my community engagement in ways that I'm so grateful for. Dr. Fanny Rushing, who is wrapping up a 23-year career at Benedictine University in Chicago, who is a SNCC veteran, lifelong Chicagoan, Um, and, was a part of the development of Black studies in the 90s at Northwestern University, where Charles Payne was the director, right? Charles Payne, the sociologist and historian of I've Got the Light of Freedom, which I'm teaching this semester, The Organizing Tradition and the Mississippi Freedom Struggle. I was disillusioned in my fifth and sixth year of the PhD at Northwestern, weary of the whole market and marketing of my work, and what universities might want to pick me up, and what kind of pay I might be receiving or not receiving.
That's demoralizing shit, man.
Ooh,
Yeah.
it was bad. It was bad. And, as bad as it was for me in 2018, the precipice was coming just that next year with, the pandemic. And so, during my, prospectus writing phase, my PhD advisor, John Marquez, who writes on Black-Brown solidarity in the Gulf South in Houston, he told me I should go to this, SNCC history conference program, symposium. So I go. I don't meet Fanny Rushing, who's the brainchild behind this nonprofit that archives and organizes conferences, honoring and critically engaging the history of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which had a Chicago area Friends of SNCC to raise money for the Southern campaign, but also importantly organized the largest school boycott in U.S. history. In 1963, protesting racism in Chicago, right? Ben Willis was the superintendent at the time, and he had, Black students in trailers. Meanwhile, across the street, you had white students in white schools with empty classrooms, right? And so Fanny Rushing was a 17-year-old in that moment, and as Cleveland Sellers writes in his book, The River of No Return, the autobiography of an ex-militant and the life and death of SNCC, once you enter the river, you don't leave. And these SNCC veterans across a range of political perspectives, right, and spectrum, are still doing that work. And I include the SNCC Legacy Project in this as well. But I go to this conference and I see Bree Newsome engaging with Dr. James Garrett, engaging with Charlie Cobb. And it was a great moment for me to think about the relevance of my work in a non-institutional setting, but also about my research and writing and teaching. And so fast forward to 2018, I'm trying to finish up, disillusioned as hell. And there's another conference called the Global 60s. And so I just go on the website and I offer to volunteer. My best opportunities have come through volunteering in life, right? Doing something for free and building community. And so I go into this iconic house in Hyde Park in the south side of Chicago, where Sylvia Fisher had been for decades hosting Black radicals who would come from the South and stay in Chicago in her house, and enter a study group with the Chicago SNCC History Project in preparation for this conference that ended up being a disaster in terms of attendance. We had amazing conference lineup and a series of discussions and films, but it was during the election of Lori Lightfoot, who was, battling Toni Preckwinkle at the time, two Black women following up Rahm Emanuel's disastrous mayorship in Chicago. And it was then that I got sort of included into this community of folks who are taking a serious look at SNCC and thinking about Black education for liberation, right? And so that sort of rescued me and renewed my kind of energy in what I could do in Black studies. It was around that time that I put in an application to University of Louisiana, Lafayette, and the only job offer I got was down here in Southwest Louisiana, quote unquote, home of Cajun Creole country. And had it not been for faculty who are now close friends in the history department who understood that my dissertation titled Post-Civil Rights in the Hold, right? The hold being Christina Sharp's kind of an Afro-pessimist and or, kind of metaphor for ongoing forms of anti-Blackness. I was trying to think through, this post-civil rights moment being still caught in this kind of structural relation. He understood I could still teach Black history in this department and would bring something unique and different. And so I became the first, Black Studies doctoral student or graduate hired at this, 17,000 student public university in Louisiana, which I have to say now, having left and returned, how often do you resign from university and come back? Is a good fit for me. Okay.
You might be the only person who resigned and returned.
I did so much important work here and busted my butt when I got here fall 19 to develop, courses. The survey course I teach every semester is a critical survey of Black history beyond 1619. And, ironically enough, this history department that I'm in, it's a history, geography, philosophy department, but they have this disgusting research fund because the son of a banker who was a master's student donated all of his stock and shares to the history department, some many millions of dollars sitting in Wall Street, accruing, interest that we get to spend down here. Salaries are that of a state university in Louisiana, and yet I have access to more funds than most of my colleagues at elite universities from Emory, Cornell, or otherwise. And so,
there's a lot of secret funds in Louisiana universities. I have some friends at LSU, and it's a place that, unfortunately, of course, like so many states, red states especially, just decimating their public education, but
Yep.
have really, I don't want to say noble histories, that's too far, but notable histories of investment in education, private investment in education that sneaks by. So I'm glad to hear that you're having that experience.
It goes a long way to being able to go to a conference without having to present and just soak up the intellectual engagement, build community, and think through your work. Also, to your question about being in a discipline like being in a department like history and teaching those history classes, I think I have more leeway here than I would at my undergraduate alma mater, UAB. Right, that has a African American Studies program, but the narrow conception of Black Studies there would limit the kinds of classes I could teach. So I've taught a class on historical methodologies and research for the history department here, but it was called Archiving Black History and Mapping Blackness. We read Dion Brand's A Map to the Door of No Return, but we also read formal kind of historical methodology research. And so in the classroom, I'm able to do a lot that I have just the unequivocal support, and I'm fortunate because this has not been the case of this department historically, right? Of white administrators who support whatever I want to do in the classroom within reason, but also go above and beyond. So in 2021, I became the object of antagonism for right-wing anti-library folks in Lafayette. There was this Louisiana for the Endowment for the Humanities program called Who Gets to Vote? The History of Voting Rights in Louisiana or in the U.S. They had picked 6 books. One was Martha Jones' Vanguard, another one by Carol Robertson, at Emory. Carol Anderson, Carol Anderson, yes. And so this white librarian reached out to me in, December of 2020 to see if I would facilitate a book discussion, which is up my alley in terms of civil rights movement history, Black freedom movement history. And much to my surprise, he won the grant, $1,300 to pay honorarium and buy books for the community. The Library Control Board was appointed by the Lafayette City Council, rejected the grant on the basis that myself and another faculty from American University would not tell, quote, both sides of the history of voting rights, right? Saying the quiet part out loud, that if there's one history of Black folks demanding the right to vote, the other side is this group of folks who clearly see themselves in that history of the White Citizens Council, of the Klan, of Strom Thurmond, right, who are doing everything they can to keep up this particular, evolution of white supremacy legally alive. And so that experience was somewhat scary in terms of right-wing groups going through my social media, looking at my voting record to try and cast aspersions on me really just for being Black and professor in Louisiana. I had no publications from which they could make this basis that I was going to tell a quote biased history of voting rights, but was able to get the grant moved from the Lafayette Public Library to my university library. We did the talks virtually because it was during the height of the pandemic. But it also planted a seed of like, how can I respond to this in a way that is not just reacting to obvious low-grade anti-intellectualism and white supremacy, but like invest in Black futures. And so I wrote a proposal for this Map to Black Studies project that I'm very proud of. To date, have purchased 791 books in a range of topics in Black studies for this library in Louisiana. We have another $50,000 to spend over the next couple years, right? And obviously there's impetus to spend more soon. But like, I was really just going to spend $30,000 one year. I had white colleagues in my department say, why don't we do it multi-year? And instead of $30,000, you do $30,000 initial investment, and then we'll do $10,000 over the next 3 years. By the way, let's also include programming so we can bring some of these scholars into UL. By the way, let's also invest in the Ernest J. Gaines Center. If you didn't know, Ernest Gaines, you know, the iconic writer of the autobiography of Miss Jane Pittman, A Lesson Before Dying, returned to Lafayette or returned to Point Coupé Parish in the 1980s, 90s, and taught at UL for 20 years. And so his archive of papers from Baldwin, Toni Morrison is all located literally in the office that I'm sitting in right now, right? And so I had this idea to invest all these books in the Gaines Center, which is one of the few Black spaces on campus. And so it's been a challenge and a gift to really think through, right, how to ethically purchase, not through Amazon, but through Black bookstores, right, books that speak to Black studies, and not just from my own kind of like personal interest in gender sexuality studies or Black visual culture, but like really try to build like a library that would reflect the dearth and diversity of Black studies scholarship that, of course, is mostly from traditional disciplines. But like, I always say Black studies scholars are among the sharpest, and folks, I have 3 degrees in Black studies. You have to know sociology as a field and the Black content produced in sociology. Same with history, same with literature, same with political science and political theory. And so buying those books, though, and trying to organize that in like subsections has been, again, a challenge and a gift, because it expands my work from just, you know, a educator in the classroom or a scholar producing knowledge to like building collaborative connections through libraries, librarians, archivists, students, researchers, community who we want also to have access to these books in a state that has obviously been under attack in terms of scholarship and really just engagement with Black life, right?
I love that. That's, you know, it's such an important way of thinking about this word that comes up in so many of these podcasts, and just so much a conversation about the meaning of Black studies, which is community, and how to think about community scholarship and teaching in that really expansive way. And what I like about, I mean, I like a lot of things about what you said, but one of the things that really stuck out to me is this sense of opportunism, right? Of like, this money comes up. Well, now we know what to do, right? Because we have this sense of where do you invest in a way that cultivates a community to come, not just the community that was or that is. So, I love that. Let me ask you this question as one of the sort of last 2 questions I want to ask you. This one's about the history of the field. When you look at the history of the field of Black studies, what do you think that Black studies has done well? Particularly well, but also what do you think it has not done particularly well?
We'll be generous first and think through, right, the community aspect. We were talking about the integral role of these office managers, administrators. I hate both of those terms because they don't really detail the kind of glue that often Black women are 2 Black Studies departments. This was the case at Ohio State with Miss Jeannie. This was the case with Suzette DeNose and Marjorie McDonald at Northwestern, and the case with Miss Vern Steele Bush at UAB, who I still make an effort to go see in Birmingham whenever I'm visiting family, right? Like, I left, UL for this small Catholic, university that's imploding in the suburbs of Chicago that had no administrative staff because the austerity had hit so hard. They're $8 million in debt. They had cut that, and now the, administrative staff for the dean of the College of Liberal Arts runs administrative staff for all the departments, right?
Yeah,
and so it was the first time I felt the absence of that role. And even here at UL, it's a Black woman, Rosalind Green, who, when I left the first time, made sure I had boxes to pack, great heavy-duty boxes, who makes sure you get paid, who understands the bureaucracy at the university, who does this extra other mothering kind of work for so many students, undergrads, junior faculty, that goes unnoticed. And so I would say, my grandmother and aunts were all Black women domestic workers in Alabama. And because of Darlene Clark Hine, who was at Northwestern, I think of the work that Black women do and what Black Studies affords that work beyond just, right, the position of the professor or the student. That might also be both Black and woman, but also these roles as office administrators that, is about sustaining and building communities, which we know Black women have done historically and continue to do in so many ways because of that gendering and racializing work. And so, I have at times struggled to find community in Black Studies departments, but find that locus of convening to be important, both for communities as well, who, there's a film screening on Otabanga, or there was one here at UL last week on ancestral artistry, looking at the history of Black and Creole or African and Creole brick masons who are part of the Louisiana architecture, right? Black Studies is often a home for those film screenings, a home for a big name celebrity. I don't love Stephen A. Smith, but right, or an Imani Perry or a Nikki Giovanni, right, who are coming to campus. Black Studies is like that site, and so it can be the site of attraction in ways that are both good and bad. I'll say maybe just as one critical limitation. I had a 2-year speaker series I did at UL in which we brought in scholars virtually to record first lectures the first year and the second time to do a kind of conversation, building off the Chicago SNCC History Project's method of a collective oral history gathering, that when you have folks who are veterans of the movement in the room together, there are memories that pop up that wouldn't show up in a traditional kind of researcher subject kind of dynamic. And so this is informed by Gracie Boggs and Jimmy Boggs' book, Conversations in Maine, which is really about the post-67 uprisings in Detroit and Newark, and like what new directions must the Black freedom movement take in order to be responsive to communities. And this method of having conversations came to mind. But conversations alone won't cut it, right? In fact, bringing in a speaker to present their work and be the Black object of consumption for that evening might prevent the investment in a tenure track position in Black studies or in Black history. And so what I try to do with the speaker series is build a working group in which we are reading the work of these scholars before they come. We have a separate convening with them virtually to talk about their work, and then they present, right? But like there is this kind of tokenizing work that universities, do that just wants to have the Black performer or speaker, which can become a performer, come and that's it, a kind of one-off, right? Yeah. As opposed to doing that kind of organizing work, building community across Black student organizations, across departments in which there are faculty who are doing Black studies work, but maybe not in a Black studies department, right? And so, the institutionalization of Black studies is a real unfortunate development more generally that this is a product of, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, we have to have jobs and we have to have some stability, but all things come with benefits and prices in these moments. But, I think it's particularly pointed in the case of Black Studies, which as you've drawn our attention to across this conversation, has a set of obligations and responsibilities and commitments that I think bring that, what's lost, right? Really into focus and really bold. So let me ask you this as a last question. And so rather than thinking about the past Black Studies and thinking about what we've done well and not so well, actually come back to you and ask you, in the context of this field, what do you think is the issue you would want us to be thinking about, or the question you would want us to be asking?
That is actually a great question. I am really critical of these master narratives or mythologies of Black freedom narratives, the civil rights movement, Black Lives Matter, emancipation, that keep popping up, and really invested in our weariness of them. And so negativity is the word that comes to mind, a kind of critical negativity that I see scholars like Zalika Ibrahimi, who was on the podcast, grad student who's wrapping up at Brown, Zuri Arman, are thinking about not just Black study, but dark study, dark being a kind of philosophy of negativity that I think folks gloss in relation to Afro-pessimism as like this boogeyman of a fatalist kind of anti-Black neoliberal Black studies. But I think at its best, Afro-pessimism is challenging the neoliberal incorporation of Black studies, which is to say the neoliberal incorporation of difference writ large across institutions, not just the university, but government, the nonprofit sector. And so I am interested in those negative affects and negative responses to, museum like the one in Montgomery, which I have a mixed relationship to. The Equal Justice Initiative's Peace and Justice Memorial and Legacy Museum are both colloquially referred to as the lynching memorial, right? Which is the most visited tourist site in the state of Alabama now, Montgomery, not Birmingham.
Wow.
That is a monumental achievement for Brian Stevenson, who does great work, but it is invested in the politics of reconciliation explicitly, which a scholar like Christina Sharp is explicitly rejecting, right? A turn toward the history of lynching, a turn toward histories and present day examples of Black suffering, and saying forgiveness and reconciliation is what we have to promote and project and celebrate and find identity within, that I think a critical negativity too allows us to unsettle what I think are, a kind of cruel optimism, to quote Lauren Berlant, or a kind of double bind of freedom, to quote Saidiya Hartman, right? In which, Black representation will not save us, right? Alone, as one thing Sharp emphasizes over and over, and these narratives of Black excellence that have a kind of damning positivity associated with them. That I'll never forget Zakiya Iman Jackson asking this question at a Black Feminist Futures conference at Northwestern. Black study or Black excellence is a response to a racist question. Right? And I always ask my students this and other audiences this, what is the question? And people are stopped in their tracks. Wait a minute. I just assume Black excellence to be this positive thing, or I assume Black studies to be this positive thing, or I assume the Civil Rights Museum or the Lynching Man to be this positive thing. Invested in a racial progress narrative of reform that does not get at these ongoing structures of anti-Blackness or white supremacy or settler colonialism, that I think a healthy rejection and negativity in response to, in this imagining of dark study, right, through Zalika, Zuri, and other folks, allows us, I think, to unsettle and maybe not offer a solution, right? Miriam Kaba has this excellent buzzword, solutionarian, right? She's not invested necessarily in just the solution, but we need to have space to ask these critical questions and not police folks within Black studies or outside of it, right? With this air of policing something as negative and or positive, which might seem obvious, but it shows up time and again in doctoral training for Black students. Can't tell you how many students are punished for even daring to engage in adjacent Afro-pessimist analytics, which I wouldn't claim as like my work, but I would, I certainly think needs to be a part of our conversations across the field. And so negativity as a way of unsettling a toxic positivity, I would say, is where I do see grad students, and I'm forever invested in what undergrads and grad students are doing to challenge the university, to challenge Black studies, to challenge Black professors, to be more committed in their questions, to be more committed in the rigor of their scholarship, of their teaching, and understand where those limits are. Right? Stuart Hall thinking at the limit. What is the limit of this post-civil rights kind of celebration of Birmingham as the cradle of the civil rights movement? And how does it limit Black students, of which I was one, saying, wait a minute, tolerance certainly wasn't what the Black freedom movement was about achieving. And yet I'm hearing tolerance at the Civil Rights Institute downtown, and then seeing a Confederate flag as a symbol of school spirit in my high school at the same damn time. Like, it was just jarring as a student. And so I'm still in search of answering these questions of my experience in that moment of like conflicting, contradictory experiences of what it means to be Black in the South, and demanding, answers of which there are no easy answers, right? So I think that's where I'm excited about in terms of the field and scholarship, because there's a lot of really good stuff that young folks are doing, and doctoral students are doing that are pushing the field forward.
I love that. Wonderful place to conclude. And really, Theodore, thank you so much for this hour conversation. It's been fantastic. I was looking forward to it. And there's just so much in this conversation for people to think about. I'm really happy to have you in the series. It's going to be a fantastic episode. So thank you for your time. But I always like to say in these cases, like, thank you for your thoughtfulness, for really bringing like a full vision and seriousness to the conversation. I appreciate you.
Likewise with the questions, and continue. I do hope we get that 2012 Beautiful Struggle podcast up, but more importantly, I think continuing the conversation in a critical way that builds community is something I see you all doing in a really important and beautiful way. Beautiful struggle to do all these podcasts. So thank you for your labor, editing, posting, and building through this platform.
Thank you. I'll pass it on to Ashley and Bree. So we really appreciate that kind of recognition. So thank you, and have a great rest of your day.
You too.
All right. Bye-bye.